Conscient Podcast, episode 167. Ecological artist and researcher Barbara Cuerden.
But the garden doesn't have to be something that's instrumental. It can be just a place where you sit, where you're thinking of growing something, where the sun shines and where photosynthesis takes place and everything is sort of manifested through the sunlight and the water. And I mean, it's a fantastic thing on its own without actually having to produce a lot of stuff.
And what if gardens were works of art? Barbara Cuerden is a neighbor of mine in Sandy Hill, which is a neighborhood of Ottawa. She's a colleague in ecological art and a family friend. Barbara completed a master's degree in eco-literacy and place-based education in 2010 at the University of Ottawa, and is also a professional back-of-the-book indexer, among other things. Overall, her artworks and her way of life, I think, reflect local particularities of place and time. And when I asked Barbara to be a guest on the Conscient Podcast, she wrote to me with the following thought that I think you'll appreciate. The solution is nature, which is still out there in the world outside of our heads. We belong to it. A feeling of connection with the air, the light, the green, the animals. That feeling of connection most of us felt naturally as children. That connection can be found again and again. And like you say, it can be accessible if we allow for it to take hold of us. So during our conversation, Barbara and I talked about many connections and points of contact. And we concluded, not surprisingly, that we would all be well served to pay more attention to local particularities of place and time. And there were some very poignant moments during our exchange, which you'll hear. For example, when Barbara told me the story about a seminar where John K. Grandy was speaking, and where she said, "I consider myself as an eco-artist until I heard him speak about the meaninglessness of spectacle. Reading his stuff changed my life, and thus I became a non-entity." And we talked about this idea of being a non-entity during our conversation. It reminded me of a Conscient episode, number 74, called Letting Go, where I talk about the main barrier to my re-education is me, and that the solution simply is to let go. So letting go and connecting, reconnecting, is one of the themes that we talked about. At the end, you'll hear Barbara recommend Jenny Odell's Reading the Rocks podcast on Emergence magazine. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you.
It's nice to have you in the home. Just yesterday we were doing a potluck here on art and ecology, and you were part of that. And you live in the same neighborhood as me here in Ottawa, Sandy Hill, and we've been exchanging over the years bits and pieces. More recently, because you've been responding publicly to some of the postings I've made, which I really appreciate. And so there's lots for us to talk about because we have affinities, and I have a lot of curiosities about your work and your research and that. But as I usually do with the podcast, I'll ask you just to introduce yourself informally and let people know who you are and some of your background as an artist and as an activist.
Okay, thanks, Clodagh. I have to say that your inviting me to do this has caused me to reflect a great deal on past work. And it's really hard to shovel it into one little, nutshell. But maybe we can start, with the evening yesterday, which you so generously hosted here. And because that brought to mind something that I attended the Fifth World Education, Environmental Education Conference, and that was in Montreal in 2009. And Stephen Lewis was one of the keynote speakers, and he does a lot of work with AIDS and women's rights and Africa and a lot of stuff. And he was a speaker, and he said, and there was maybe 2,000 people from all over the world there. And he said, I know that many of you are the only people in the room thinking about these things when you're in your lives. And here we all are in this one space. And that was really wonderful, because I had felt often that I was the only person in the room thinking about these things, about ecology and eco-literacy and art. And so to be in a room with 4, 5, 6 other people last night, and we are all there to talk, it was just really lovely. It wasn't a didactic or some kind of seminar. It was just a bunch of people who were able to be in one room together and who'd been thinking about these things for a long time. So, yeah, thank you for that. That was really a kind of mind-blowing. I didn't expect that. So, yeah.
And what is your background?
I was born in a little tiny place called Whitley Woods in Lancashire, England. And so the cuerden name stretches back. It's a very local name. It's about 500 years old in that area. So my family, you could say, well, they've been there for a long time. And so there is a kind of eco-literacy that goes with that length of time in one small place. Anyway, then another influence was in high school, 5 years of being on my friend's farm, which was a mixed farm. And then here in Sandy Hill, they had the Canadian Organic Growers Library, which was on Chapel Street, up near the church. And I used to get the magazine and read it. I was a member of Canadian Organic Growers. And then somebody I went to art school with, Linda Hall, she had a job with Canadian Organic Growers, and she started this project called Growing Up Organic. And we put together a little program for a week of young people. I think they were 9 to maybe 13 years old. And we spent a few days camped out at Alpenblick Farm. And it was just kind of great. I mean, they had to dig their own and build their own latrine. And, we ate organic food and helped milk the goats and stuff. And so after that, I did my master's thesis using a garden, because the Growing Up Organic program was also about schoolyard gardens. So my master's thesis in education was built around a garden that I grew on campus in those horrible cement planter boxes. And I decolonized the site by growing corn, beans, and squash, and then a little monoculture of wheat across the road. Anyway, my youth in Whittle was a kind of garden experience because it was very rural, beautiful countryside, the canals and canal boats going through. I mean, it's a very sort of gentle landscape there. And my mother knew all the names of all the plants. And anyway, this stuff, it goes with you for a long time. And led me to other things. So I've always felt that connection to the natural world that perhaps other people struggle with, but for me is kind of always there. And then I got involved in the arts, and I got grants, and I did a big piece at the Museum of Civilization of projections of the phases of the moon and all that stuff. And then I was at this little panel discussion, and I'm sure that Dawn was there, Dawn Dale, and this guy, John Grand. And I even think that maybe Susie Gablick was there, the Re-Enchantment of Art. And during that time, John Grand said, talked about spectacle and how that is a kind of distancing thing. And that just kind of killed my desire for spectacle, which is kind of what I was doing, these massive projections. And so I guess I don't know whether it's an evolution or a devolution or degrowth or what, but then my attention was turned to much smaller levels of awareness, I suppose, a more nuanced look at nature and how we're part of it. But, one of the influences for that work, which I called regeneration hoodoo, the last one at the museum was a guy called Ishmael Reed. And he said, instead of the dying light of Western civilization, why not a swinging hoodoo cloud? He's a black writer from the States. And to me, that was like, yeah, why this dying light of Western civilization? Why not this kind of diverse circus or parade or, Carnival.
Or potluck. Or potlatch, if you want.
Or potlatch. That's right. Something a little more swinging. That, So I guess that's as far as I got here.
Well, it's an ongoing process, right? Because who are we anyway, right? We can rethink who we are. And I was quite touched. You sent me an email a couple of days ago about that John Grandi. John Grandi is an important writer about art and nature and many of those earlier movements of eco art, which, it's not a new thing, right? Eco art. And yet there's this excitement now. So, we need to do more ecological art. Well, humans have always had a relationship with ecology, and they've always expressed themselves. It's just we've lost touch, clearly, with our relationship to nature and to each other and the other than human beings. And I think that's what you're saying. Mm-hmm. And I was touched by, I think you used a term like non-entity,
Yes, I became a non-entity after
what does that mean?
Well, I was visible as an artist for a while, and then I just wasn't. And maybe...
but still doing the work, just not needing the attention, that kind of...
Not wanting to write grant applications anymore.
Be part of the system.
And, the system is kind of terrifying if you don't want to be always looking around for opportunities and what is the next thing I should do, and maintaining a kind of whatever a public profile is in the arts. I was just starting to have one, and then I just didn't.
I mean, part of the motivation there is to make a living, and
that's right.
But there are other avenues, other ways of combining practices. A lot of people I know have other professions as well as their artistic profession, and they make a living in a cobbling, but also a harmonious way, because that pressure of having to sell yourself and your practice, which is essentially what you do as a professional artist. People have to buy somehow or remunerate you. Grants help because they take some pressure off, but then you're in relationship with the state and its expectations. So one way or another, you're in relationship. And I guess it's just a choice, right? You've made a choice.
Right. And one of your guests last night, Ellen, she asked generally, has anyone ever stopped doing their work, stopped their practice, and how did that feel? Mm-hmm. And in light of what you just said, I stopped. I was part of Blink Gallery for many years, and then the NCC took over that building again. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Blink Gallery was a tiny kind of stone gardener's hut across from the National Gallery. Just, what is that park called that's Parliament, across from Parliament Hill? Majors Hill. Yes, it's a major. Yes, it's something military like that. Majors Hill Park. Yeah. Anyway, and so there was a bunch of us who used to present other artists, actually, than ourselves in that space. And then the NCC, National Capital Commission, took it over, retook it. And we no longer had a site. So why am I saying that? Oh, congruent to that, I was working for the International Development Research Center. And Blink Gallery and our group was kind of over. And I was working for IDRC, and I just stopped making art. I think I was just exhausted by the whole thing. And to the point where, I'd be walking past or driving past a gallery, and I'd go, oh, thank God I'm not doing that anymore, because it's so intense. You're always sort of focused on the next thing, what am I going to do to survive, and how am I going to present myself so that it's some kind of compelling work. I don't know.
Well, you remember last night in this very room, there was Maria Gomez, who's an artist here in Ottawa, and there was Sanita Fezic, who was also on this podcast. And somebody said, I consider gardening as art, right? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And that's not that big a stretch because, design, horticulture, it's part of it's a cultural practice, and why wouldn't it be art if the person who's doing it has that intent to whatever art is. We can talk about that. But I'm liking that idea of the local these days, in particular because I worked in Canada Council for years, and that's the national scene, and then I was connected internationally on different things. And somewhat neglecting my roots, because I was actually born here in 1959 in Ottawa.
Right.
And my mother grew up in Vanier, my father grew up in Hull, so there are family roots here, the Schreiers and the Cotes and the Levings, and they're all colonial presence, but still, as settlers, this is the region where the geography has informed us. Mm-hmm. And so to have more local connections that are, artistically based, like what we did yesterday, having conversations, but also maybe some art practices that are, with local sounds and that kind of thing. I'm as I get older, and maybe I'm less mobile, and I'm thinking, well, what am I doing in my locality that's significant or that's meaningful to people around? So, Barbara, let's talk a bit about art and the role of art at the ecological crisis, because I've been harping away at this for years now, and it keeps evolving, right? But I'd like to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I have a hard time with it, actually. I'm not sure how influential artists are, or whether we have to think of ourselves in those terms even. Something you made me remember as well with that question is I read I used to read Kurt Vonnegut books a long time ago in my 20s. And one of the things he said was that during the Vietnam War in the States, all the artists were against the Vietnam War. It was like a collective laser beam of anti-war sentiments. And that had as much effect on anything as climbing a step ladder and dropping a banana cream pie. And really, yeah, it's like we can have this, and maybe it's this sort of grand notion of a national collective or a big statement or some kind of awareness at some level that artists are supposed to be effective. I'd like that. I'd like artists to be political and to have an effect. But really that's kind of antithetical to who we are, which we can do the collective thing, but then we have to do our own thing, and nobody's the boss of me, right? That's kind of part of it. And I'm not sure how much farther I've got than that. I think, like working with Linda Hall, who's an artist also with the Growing Up Organic project, that was really great, but not really self-sustaining. It takes a lot of energy to build gardens, and we were doing it in the spring, which is a very short planting season. The growing season in Canada is very short. And at that time, I think after we'd done a couple of gardens, there was one at Muchmore School and one somewhere else. And then there was these requests for us to help gardens be implemented at schools. Well, there's just not enough people around. If you're a gardener or a farmer, you are planting in the spring and you don't have time for anything else. And then the maintenance of the schoolyard gardens, where there's no students on site during the summer, you have to have a kind of watering schedule or somebody monitoring them so that they can actually produce things for the fall when the kids get back, and that's usually a pile of tomatoes and cucumbers or something. I'm just those are hard practical things, but the garden doesn't have to be something that's instrumental. It can be just a place where you sit, where you're thinking of growing something, where the sun shines and where photosynthesis takes place and everything is sort of manifested through the sunlight and the water. And I mean, it's a fantastic thing on its own without actually having to produce a lot of stuff. I think I've digressed.
Well, you put your finger on a dilemma of the impact of art, because it's hard to measure. A lot of my colleagues try, and they do. They use statistics and they use stories and they use anecdotes, and there are ways to measure. Because if you ask somebody, has a work of art impacted you? They'll say, sure, this song, this story, this play. And yet we don't know how it actually informs their decisions on the longer term, because it's part of a process of soaking in experiences, and artistic experiences are very powerful because they're allegories and they're metaphors and they're illusions and dreams and all that. So I understand what you're saying in the sense that the artist does what he, she, or they do, and that's it. They go out there and they create the work or not. But as a collective of citizens, this is what I'm interested in: is how can artists work together to inform policy, to inform. And it's a bit of a hybrid. It's a combination, I think, of their art practice, which is powerful, but also their cooperation and their working together. And like here in Ottawa, the organization Scale has its headquarters, and that's a coalition, a network of networks. And that's useful because then, like you said earlier, that idea of isolation, am I the only one worried about the end of the world? Absolutely not. Because you talk to anybody and they are concerned, and some of them feel disempowered, but I think that artists should be talking about the issues that are close to their hearts, and the environment is part of it, but social justice, climate justice, whatever it is. But they should be doing it in a way that's not necessarily narrowing the scope, but broadening the scope, broadening the conversation, like you say, with in other practices and other fields. It's more. It's a time more than ever where we need to branch out and to create coalitions and to say, well, let's have an artist be part of this committee or part of this process, and let's give them a decent wage so that they can live from it. And that's what I aspire to. And yet there's so many barriers, including the artists themselves who are feeling isolated. So let's break that isolation and bring resources and opportunities and potential and confidence. Not that they lack confidence, but just a sense of connection. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah. And it brings to mind, I was, they had an artist in the schools program at one point, the OCDSB, or maybe it was the Roman Catholic Board, because I was at St. Bridget's for a summer, actually 2 summers. And they had this summer school program and an artist in the school. And I was one. And, it was pretty great. But as an artist, you can be sort of crossing boundaries that you shouldn't, because you don't know the ropes, right? Because we had this incident with my group, which was a bunch of groups actually, but somebody found a dead bat. And so for that week, we made this whole thing about the dead bat. We were going to find a burial spot for it. We were going to make masks and do a kind of morning parade. So we did this thing, people dressed up in black with their masks and walking past the school to a field where we could bury the bat. Well, that was not something that, I just thought this would be great. And the kids were really into it, but it wasn't really something that the school thought was a good use of time. So I'm just saying that artists' involvement is good in ways that kind of carry what people are thinking or how they're feeling, or are able to kind of put things into a form that's, like you say, like a carnival. I love the idea of a carnival, and we need it. We need a carnival, but there's so many rules and regulations, and, the wilder elements can overstep some of the quieter ones. So, you've worked in the arts. I think you've probably seen both the quiet and the kind of fabulous experimental. It's a kind of a tightrope walk, I think, being an artist in or outside of the arts, or being involved in communities that don't necessarily understand what artists are up to. Mm-hmm. We don't always know what we're up to either. I'm reading a book by Morgan Meese. He's kind of an art historian critic. He has a way of writing that's interesting. Anyway, this book is about Franz Marc and the Blue Writer group. And he says, Marc wasn't a great painter. He was only a really great painter for a couple of years, and then it was World War I, and he was involved in it, and he died in it. And he goes on to say that at the same time that Franz Marc was doing these sort of wild, the Blue Writer, expressionist paintings, sort of futurist stuff, you had a guy called Paul Klee, who was not involved in the war or in expressionism or in any kind of futurist kind of avant-garde project. He did his little drawings and his little paintings, and he And he changed the world doing that. You know what I mean? And then there was like a World War II and all these, this terrible thing going on. And then you had a guy like Matisse who painted these beautiful pictures throughout those war years. And it's like, well, can we be both?
Can we be both, and can we become things that we don't think we can? When we allow ourselves to disconnect from some of the conventions of things that I talk about my unlearning journey through this podcast, and it's hard to do. I've learned a lot of things in a very hard way, what I consider my values and my all this. And as I question them, I just did a course called Alchemize with the Green Dreamer podcast, and episode 161 is a conversation about that. And it's so interesting. I'm 64, I'll be 65 this year, to continue to learn, but to learn to unlearn in a way that lets go some of the baggage, and then you don't know what will inhabit your spirit. It could be a walk in the forest where the forest literally helps you heal, because it does.
Yes.
Right? And you've experienced it, and those are privileges, to have access to a forest, to have the time and the space. But there's something that you were writing about in that email to me about where we are, and we not needing to necessarily go and search for things that we have a lot right around us that we're not either aware of or not paying attention to. Right. So that maybe that's one of the secrets, is there's air everywhere. And some of it's a better quality than others, but there's life around us. And are we connected to that life? And are we truly, and then if we want to create art and call it art, then great. But it might not be necessary to go into that formal art process when we are in fact alive and connected to the things around us.
Yeah. And I think it's been said that we can't save the earth, but the earth can save us. And I think that I really kind of buy into that, because if you are able to connect with the earth, if you allow for it, I think the earth can cure us, because it's informative. That experience is can be a kind of catastrophic in a way, where like you start to sense things. It's like an artistic experience where something really grabs you and you're like, oh, that really makes me feel like this. Or perhaps, just having your feet on the ground and allowing for the earth to inform you. It's not something you can count on, but it's something that can happen. There's a lot of people out there who've been doing fantastic work on ecology, and like I say, I worked at the IDRC, and I read many papers over the past 40 years of climate change adaptations. That was a huge research area, and people have been working on this stuff for decades. There are answers out there, whether we can use them or not, whether we can slow down enough to, as you say, as you're doing, to listen. That's a big part of it. Yeah.
And we keep learning. I was listening today, it's April 11th today, to a Green Dreamer podcast about listening and criticality in listening, and not making assumptions about that listening is good. And art didn't say this, but that art is good. I try to nuance all those things and listen to the information that resonates with me, and not pass judgment on it right away, right? Because right or wrong, put it in a box. It's information, or it's knowledge, or whatever you want to call it, sensations coming into your body, and then you just let it sit there for a while.
Yeah.
And you don't have to process it right away.
Yeah.
Because it'll process itself in a way if you let it, if you give it space, right?
And that's, I was looking at John Grant's work yesterday, and one of the things, just a little sort of aside in what he wrote, was we process experience as information rather than as a felt experience. And that, I think that's a speeded up kind of version of how we are in the world. everything is information. All our experiences are information. They're not allowed to just kind of sit and inform us eventually, or our expectation is it's all information to be used rather than something that we can sit with and then that it informs us at some point.
Us and future generations by what we do and what we don't do, right? Because we tend to be, I want to talk a bit about that. You quoted Bill McKibben in your response to one of my postings about the David Maggs article. And you talked about how artists have been essentially trained to be individual voices, right? And McKibben's quote is, stop being an individual, join a group, right? Which is, it seems obvious, but not everyone does it. And that notion of individualism and how we've been trained to have an individual voice is not a bad thing because, if you're an author, you have a voice, if you're an artist. And yet that individuality is problematic because we've isolated ourselves. And it comes back to this theme of... But anyway, why did you write that? I thought that was an interesting comment.
Oh, I think it was something to do with a question that you had asked in one of your conversations. And, I guess I thought that maybe this group that you were starting to form was going to be something instrumental. We were going to work on something and provide a solution to something and get the world to listen to what we had to say. And, maybe that could happen. But on the other hand, you can be part of something that's already going on, like a gardening group or the tree and greening group that's here in Sandy Hill that are doing pollinator gardens. And I'm also part of Ottawa Field Naturalist Club, and they do really good work too. And you get studies that are carried on in the region. You get to read about what people are doing. And to me, that gives me a feeling like there's places where you can do kind of hands-on things that are with people who are similarly interested, that they're kind of lively, and they involve the ecologies around us in our local area. And this to me is maybe more important than thinking about what a bunch of artists can do as a collective. And perhaps that's my cynical side,
Well, I don't think it's right or wrong because there are artists who are gathering and talking about things they want to do together, as they always have, as collectives and as groups and as organizations. My issue is that we're in a very severe climate emergency and that not enough people are talking about it in terms of how it's impacting not just their careers, but their families and the generations to come. And I'm not saying let's all do climate art, because many are doing whatever they feel is the right kind of art they want to do. But I'm not hearing enough discourse about it. And it's not that people are in denial. It's what I said earlier. They feel disempowered. I wrote about this in my A Calm Presence newsletter. And so, I've stopped pressing the alarm button quite a while ago because it's not helpful. People know what's going on. I try to provide resources, conversations like what we talked about today, the local, the extending out through the garden, learning from the earth, allowing the earth to heal us, looking after that relationship with the earth. Those are really things that are worth repeating and going deeper into and becoming a bit vulnerable. Like, I don't know really what to do exactly, because if I did, I'd be a prophet,
Come on, work on that.
But I'm listening, and I record, and I try to share bits of exchanges that might provoke a thought in somebody who might talk to somebody else, and at a micro and then eventually a macro level, things not only change, but we prepare for change. We anticipate the period that we live in and that we're going into, and we care for our loved ones, That's where I'm at.
Right. And a lot of these things are very subtle. You're aware of things on a very subtle level that don't get talked about. And they can be fleeting. you see them, you're aware of them, you're not sure anybody else has noticed. And that's why it's good to have a conversation around these things, because you can kind of put a spotlight on a small thing. And, you know, one of my projects was called Regeneration Hoodoo. And my son is involved in now, all of a sudden, involved in regenerative agriculture. And anyway, we were talking about the job he was going to be doing, and we were both walking down the street. This was across the canal, both sort of chatting away, and he was, had a lot to say, and I was joining in, and then in the middle of it all, I saw this bunny hopping across the street, and I didn't know whether to say anything to him because he was on a roll. And he continued talking, and I said, you know what? I just saw a little bunny hopping across the street into the bush. And he goes, yeah, I saw it too. I was like, oh, that's so great. He saw it too. But I mean, I guess that's sort of to illustrate that these little things happen. We see them. We don't know whether anybody else has seen them or noticed them. They're subtle. And that's why this group was really great, because they're working on a very subtle level. And, like I say, I expected some kind of didactic sort of group. Let's do something. There was a point to it in that sort of goal-oriented way, which, as you say, things can develop out of that. But I really liked the relaxed, let's just talk amongst ourselves kind of approach.
And I encourage, I'm sure people do it all the time. There's book clubs and all kinds of gatherings that people do. This course, again, I alchemize. I had a circle every Saturday. We would get together and talk about what we learned. And so I've met new friends. And this was on Zoom because we live in different parts of the country or the continent. But I do encourage people in this post-COVID time, because COVID was so hard on many of us in many ways, and we've lost souls and we lost a lot. But we learned how precious in-person meetings are without necessarily an agenda, because the agenda happens naturally when people listen to each other. You're responding, and therefore energy is transferred, and then you might decide to do a project or not, but you have this sense of connection, and then you go for a walk together. And I love doing sound walking. Maybe we'll go for a sound walk sometime in our art and ecology group. But yeah, why not get together when we have homes? We have that possibility. So that's something that I'm putting out there. I'd love for my listeners of this podcast to tell stories about how they're gathering and what the value they have and what kind of exchanges that they've had in those in-person, informal conversations that are around affinities and around the post-panic button era. We know we're into a very difficult period. What are we doing individually together? How can we console each other? How can we support each other? Are there things that we could do in our localities, maybe working with municipal politicians who are very close to the ground, as well as the national and international stuff. But we live somewhere, and what are we doing about that?
Yeah, I think that's good. I think the panic button, yes, I've been through my panic button stage, and then you find ways to be doing something about it. But I do think the panic is part of it. Does it have to be part of it? I'm not sure, but I've certainly felt that, and I know people have felt it. But if they know that there are things that they can do that are actually really nice things, maybe that panic, that despair can be mitigated. And so you, with your podcast, you are kind of mitigating that panic, I think, because you're giving a space for people to talk about what they can do, how they feel about it. You're kind of inching things along in a way that, you're the only person I know who's doing it in this way. And it seems to be very valuable. I didn't expect that. So, thank you.
Well, and I do it in French and English because of my linguistic duality, and that's also interesting for me as a learner to have other voices and reaching out to people I know really well and other people I don't know at all, and I just want to learn from them and give them a platform. I try to end with any recommendations you have of things that you've read or seen or experienced recently that you would recommend to our listeners.
Right. Well, I did send you that bit that Jenny Odell did, just the walk in her neighborhood, the conversation with rocks, I think it was called, something like that.
Emergence magazine.
Yeah, and I really liked that. I liked the way that she kind of, she's walking blindly around this part of her neighborhood, and then she starts learning about, what's going on in a deeper sense, so that she gets in touch with real geologic time. I like the time element in her pieces because it takes time, and you reorient yourself in a certain way, and living in a place in a certain time, we all do that. This is where we are, and this is a good thing. So Jenny Odell, yeah.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you too.